Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about the AOT program in New York City and some potential interfaces between family members and caretakers and how they can be part of the larger process. The New York City is a fairly large system, and I have a lot of slides and one fly, so hopefully, hopefully I'll conquer both. We'd like you to understand the typical model of an AOT program, a model AOT program, and to understand the sort of the machinations of it, the structure of it, specifically the one in New York City and how it's designed and the legal framework. A lot of the talks over the last couple of days have been really inspiring to me and have sort of queued up a lot of the topics that I'm going to hit. Hopefully it won't be too repetitive, but we'll be able to shoot off and talk about some of the things that I think earlier talks have already introduced. We're going to talk about the interfaces that AOT has with legal partners, judicial partners, law enforcement. We're going to talk about the monitoring piece, which is really kind of the critical aspect I think that AOT brings to the landscape of outpatient treatment, as well as the advocacy work that hopefully some of you will be able to take on. We all know the story about Kendra Webdale. New York State AOT law is known as Kendra's Law. And the story of how at the end of this graph, November 8th, 1999, Kendra's Law went into effect, but actually Kendra Webdale was pushed in front of an oncoming subway train on January 3rd. That year in the press in New York, if anything happened with a mentally ill client, it was front page paper. So the press had an absolute focus on the mentally ill in New York, and that we've had several sort of seasons of that through the years, where the status of mentally ill and dangerous individuals in the community become the focus of a lot of press, for good or bad. And there are the Webdale parents with Governor Pataki signing the law into effect, and Mr. Goldstein ended up going to prison. Now he's out. You have to remember this was 1999, okay? So we didn't have TAC, we didn't have families like you in this room talking together and sharing ideas and getting educated. There was a lot of pushback on outpatient commitment law. There was concerns, very real and appropriate concerns about who's going to pay for this, where's the money going to come from, what happens if a person doesn't do what they're supposed to do? Are they going to get pinned down in the community and be given medication, as some of the judges expected us to be doing every day, to tell you the truth? What happens when something goes wrong? How do we protect the patients to make sure with the wrong individual isn't being court mandated to the wrong treatment? What sort of protections are there in place? This is whole new legal and psychiatric public mental health policy territory. I'm going to talk a little bit about Queens County, where I am the medical director of the AOT that covers that. Most of you may know Queens County is where both the airports are. But it's a really cool place to work. It's one of the 5 counties of New York City, population 2.4 million. Median household income is $72K, a little bit higher than the national average, but 10% do live in poverty. It's an incredibly diverse county, one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse set of zip codes in the entire United States. I've had to get translators from languages that I didn't know existed, and I'm a language geek, and it's just an amazing place to work. 47% are foreign born, which sort of dovetails on the issue of families from other countries, from other cultures, from other traditional ways of interfacing with the medical health system, and how different it is from this country, all right? And I really appreciate sort of being at this conference and seeing families and interfaces with mental health providers from so many different parts of the country, because there's also regional differences in the United States about how we interface. And it's great to see, and it just again, makes you humble for these relationships on so many different levels. But that's a particularly interesting part of Queens County up there in purple. It's a large county. Those are all the counties of New York City. Again, Queens is a pretty interesting place. You have that diversity, and you also have the Archie bunkers. If I see some gray hairs in the audience, so you know what I'm talking about. I was picked to run AOT back in 1999 from my work in mobile crisis. I was operating a mobile crisis team out of a hospital, city hospital. So again, peeking in people's refrigerators, knocking on doors, going up the project steps when the elevators had excrement in them, doing the work in the city, and doing these house calls when people were in crisis, when people needed to be hospitalized from the community, when families didn't know what to do. Holding, the children's hands while, a parent was being taken by the police to the hospital. AOT made a lot of sense because I knew it would help so many families more than anyone almost, because they were so desperate for something other than what mental health policy and services allowed them to access. And I saw the question of how much does one get involved? There's an impact, as one of the last speakers spoke about, what is the personal impact of this situation that I'm facing? What does it mean to me to be exposed to this? Another side note, we haven't heard a lot about trauma, and I've been speaking to a woman, I think is in the audience, who's been dealing with a lot from just the traumatizing impact of dealing with services in the community. And this conference hasn't sort of delved into trauma per se, but I know the families and the patients all have an institutional trauma to many of their experiences. And AOT usually comes into the picture when they are post-traumatized from that system. So maybe next year we might talk about some of that. So what are the potential impact of my getting involved? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is there a bad outcome for me if I get involved? Maybe I know something that nobody in the room knows, but I think they need to know. Connection to the patient might be the reason that you get involved, to make a difference, to protect, to prevent something else from happening to somebody that you might be connected to on some level. Maybe you know the family member. Maybe you're not in the family, but you love the family and you want to be involved to some degree. Maybe you feel really badly about your community and what this mentally ill individual is doing when they're not well. Maybe you're no law enforcement and you don't want law enforcement to do the wrong thing in this situation. You want to get involved to make sure that there's a good outcome. Maybe you've got a relationship to the health service. Maybe you're a health service provider that's adjacent to this whole mental health picture. But you kind of know how the system works and you know what the system can't do, and you want to get involved for that reason. Again, in 1999, these were the psychiatric inpatient beds in New York City. Queens is that kind of large blob on the right. Not a lot of inpatient bed, but a big community. So a lot of our referrals came from the community, i.e. families, clinics, as opposed to Manhattan, which, you can't swing a cat without hitting like a psychiatric inpatient bed in Manhattan. As such, even though this looks great, all these hospitals, all these inpatient units, all these clinical providers, unfortunately in New York City, they're all siloed. They don't necessarily talk to one another. They don't share information. They don't get each other on the phone. It's just like 26 people playing a different song. And so, of course, a client will just bounce from one hospital to another clinic, to another provider, to another clinic, and there's no real holder of information of like what happened here, what happened in 2002, what happened in 2003, why was 2004 so bad and 2002 so good. The investigations that AOT has to go through will sometimes collect this information, and you'll finally have a timeline for someone who doesn't really have a timeline that anyone else is holding. This is the general structure for the New York City sort of distribution of supervision and money. New York State Office of Mental Health gave money to the counties where you had mental health services. Each county needed, not could, but needed to develop an AOT system, all right? Whether you've got 5 mentally ill individuals in your county that would benefit this law or 5 million. It didn't matter, your county had to come up with an AOT program, and that was very smart. It didn't just throw money at the problem, it didn't just throw a law with no money, it threw both at the same time and tied them together. That was a huge, huge difference. With that money, you develop the AOT teams, a removal team for individuals that need to be brought into the community, some law enforcement backup, which you need, and a legal process server. The AOT teams then have a monitoring and consulting relationship with the clinics, with the care coordinators, with the ACT teams, and hopefully there's a lot of back and forth information. We'll get to that later. Caretakers are hopefully communicating with outpatient providers and care coordination and ACT teams and have the AOT as a backup if that isn't going well. Those numbers that you see there are the New York City and Queens numbers for care coordination. There's 53 teams and 12 care coordination teams in Queens. There are 50 ACT teams in all of New York City, 8 are in Queens. There's a forensic ACT team in Queens, and there are 5 for the whole city. Shelter placement ACT teams, 10 in New York City and 1 in Queens. IMT is a new model, intensive mobile treatment, that goes and looks for the people under the bridges and goes to see them again a week later, and people who are living on the subway platforms and in the tunnels, people who are bouncing from shelter to shelter and never stay anywhere more than 48 hours. Those are incredibly hard for a legal process to really envelop, and IMT teams help with that. There's 3 in Queens and 31 in the city. And again, the communication with all of those different providers you would think would be impossible, but when there's an AOT order, there's a central receptacle, a central portal for information. Okay, there's the money again. I'm gonna skip this in the interest of time. New York City had the AOT teams based in hospitals. Now we're part of the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. That's one of our buildings. We occupy 2 floors. We've investigated over 40,000 people since 1999. 20,000 of those are within New York City. The average age is 38. Just over half are men, and just over half have co-occurring substance abuse disorders. Currently, as of this month, there are about 1,700 people that we're monitoring under an AOT order in the city of New York. Obviously, most of the cases are being investigated in New York City. 20,000 petitions are filed, 65,000 of the initial AOT orders are renewed, at least once, if not multiple times over years. Half of the orders come from New York City, and I won't go into voluntary agreements in this talk, but I can talk more about it if you'd like. The criteria. Again, one of the cool things about meetings like this is that everyone is talking slightly different dialects. Everyone's program is different. So before we start comparing programs or what you should do in your program, because this is what I did in my program, is first talk about what your program is, because they're all different. From how people come into it, how they leave it, what happens when they're in it, what happens when things go wrong, they're all different. So always start out with, tell me about your program. Our program is preventative, so yes, people can get an order from an inpatient unit, an investigation that happens at that unit, but it's not based on what they did to get on that unit, it's based on what's been happening over the last several years for that person. That sort of culminated in this most recent hospitalization stay. You have to be an adult with mental illness, blah, blah, blah. At the very bottom, 2 episodes of treatment in a psychiatric inpatient or forensic or other mental health unit within the last 3 years, or 1 episode of violence to self or others, or threat or attempt at physical harm to self or others within the last 4 years, all because of noncompliance. And we have to show that noncompliance. That has to be evidence that we present in court. If that evidence is not there, they are not appropriate for our program. So it's all about noncompliance leading up to going to court. The team, it's sort of a funny question. What do you guys do all day? We actually do a lot. We accept referrals, we conduct investigations, we file petitions for community referrals, outpatient referrals, if you will. We coordinate all these services for this individual who's been court ordered to a certain set of services. And this is key, it's all happening within the AOT office, right? So it's not, there's a lot of, you've all have hospital networks, right, where you live, where 3 hospitals have gotten together or 17 hospitals have gotten together, and now they have this new quasi-Latin name for their network. But sometimes within those networks, you have good information retention, but if that person decides to go to another hospital, all that data is gone. All that data is usually not accessible. So with an AOT order, I don't care if they're going to this clinic or that hospital or even upstate, like all that information is being collected and centralized, and that's key. From the referral, that can come from absolutely anyone, a parent, a landlord, a girlfriend, doesn't matter. As long as that referral can tell us where to point our investigation, they were at this hospital 2019, 2020, and 2021 twice. Great, we know how to target that for those records. When we are doing a community investigation. Sometimes on the inpatient unit, they'll call us and, hey, Mr. Smith is here and he's been here 5 times in the last year. We want an AOT order. That record is at that hospital. That hospital is going to go to court on that case. They show us their plan. We sign off on it. They're good to go. When it's coming from the community, we have to do that work. So somebody calling us and saying, I don't know, they were in the hospital, I don't know, maybe 5 times over the last 10 years. I don't know where. We can't really do anything with that, unfortunately. Like, we can't go on a fishing expedition for possible hospitalizations for a person. That would be a violation of their civil rights. But we need to know exactly where to start looking. And then once we have an understanding of what works or what has not worked or what this person needs now, then we'd start developing a treatment plan. Again, I won't go into the voluntary. The AOT staff consists of psychiatrists, social workers, what we call care monitors. The monitors do the actual day-to-day work, the investigation work, the monitoring, the coordinating of data that's coming in from the providers into a central portal. And that portal provides weekly updates about how people are doing in the community and any significant events, i.e. bad events that are happening. Like, they went to the emergency room, they got arrested overnight, things like that. And we have attorneys that do, obviously, the legal lifting. Even though there's a variety of people that, according to statute, can petition, the bulk of any petitioner or anyone who wants an order for someone, if they're not on a hospital inpatient unit, we handle everything else. So whether you're a parent who wants an AOT order, a clinic who wants an AOT order, we just bundle all those into a community referral category, and that's handled by the AOT team. All treatment plans have to have a care coordinator or an ACT team by law. So there has to be a point person who's collecting information, who's running around double checking that the appointments are kept. That person or party is reporting back to the AOT office. And then any other component that needs to be the least restrictive plan to keep this person in the community. Not what would help. At the beginning, we would throw basically like 8 out of 9 things on a treatment plan. And nobody could handle all that scheduling. Nobody could be in all those places. So we really had to understand that what needed to be on the court order was the absolute minimum for somebody to be court ordered to comply with.
That's a question.
Yes?
So what you're saying is this treatment plan is the minimum that, so as far as the treatment, I do care coordination, case management. This is what goes on the legal document, but your actual treatment plan is more in-depth than this, but this is just what you're putting on the legal document.
Correct. When you see our treatment plan, you will see a table, a category of service, which is, at least the category on the top, and then whatever else we feel the person needs. I've had some treatment plans that have had a care coordinator and therapy, individual therapy, and nothing else. Most plans have medication. If there's a supervised residence, that goes on there. Substance abuse treatment, even if it's from what we call OASAS, or a substance abuse division, that is not mental health per se. It's sort of, it has different laws that they go by, but we can put them on our treatment plans. I won't get into the minutia of that because that's a whole other day of a conference, but yeah, it's a category of service and then the actual provider and their contact information. Those providers can change midstream during an order. The category of service is what we are monitoring. Welcome. Yes?
Yeah, quickly, so you may have covered it, I missed it, but if
Why don't you wait for the mic?
You may have covered it, and I might have missed it, but if a family is the petitioner or an interested party, do they need, in New York, do they need to have medical documentation in order to file a petition, or can they file the petition and then get the medical documentation later?
I'm not a lawyer, but technically a family could get their own lawyer, seek their own records, and present them in court, or have credible witnesses to testify for the subject of the petition. In theory, it can happen. What actually ends up happening is the AOT puts forward the petition for the patient. We get the records. We have an attorney, obviously, so we do it for the family.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if the family have some sort of release of information from the client, they can do that, or if not, then
Yeah.
AOT, but the case will move forward.
Yeah.
And the court will, that probably possible.
I highly recommend that families don't spend the money or the effort to do it themselves because it's just way too complicated. Yeah.
Right, and to subpoena records and get all that.
It's a whole
So
thing.
We changed our law so they can file per se, and the court can have the patient court evaluated by a court appointed psychiatrist in order to get whatever medical evidence. is
Yeah,
used.
yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
So I know in this conference we talk a lot about the day in court and the judges and the black robe effect, and if I've said it once, I've said it 12 times during this last couple of days, that day in court is just a day in court. The 364 other days of the year is the meat and potatoes of like what happens with this individual. What is the relationship like with their providers? What happened on Tuesday morning that they didn't go to clinic? Who's making sure that they have enough prescriptions for the 3-day weekend? The doctor's on vacation, who's covering? All the stuff that families like pull their hair out day in, day out because they don't want bad outcomes, and feel like no one else is doing it. AOT and the care coordination and the other providers who are hopefully now communicating very actively, they're hopefully taking that on. I bring up this story because it sort of upended a particular aspect of AOT that we're talking about now. In the original order, the original statute rather, we could secure records based on identifying an individual as the subject of an investigation. We could write a letter to hospital A, B, and C and have them make a copy of their records of this client from the time that they were in their hospital because he's under investigation. We would get the records and we would start our investigation. We did not need a HIPAA. We did not need a subpoena. We just needed that individual to be the subject of a letter served by a process server. You are under AOT investigation. If you have any questions, please call, blah, blah. This is for a community outpatient situation. And we would get the records. Very sweet Honduran family. Their son was very ill, had a few orders, was doing great under AOT. The family loved us. The attorney that typically represented them was on vacation. They had a substitute attorney for the latest renewal that we were going for. And that attorney just fought the whole record securing aspect of the law and kind of appealed, got the entire aspect, that section of the law revoked for the entire state of New York. Now we have to secure a HIPAA release from a client for their outpatient involuntary commitment order or get a subpoena. Usually we end up getting subpoenas most of the time, but it just adds 2 months to the investigation. So again, families can be silent. This family just didn't understand the system, so they got railroaded by this very kind of career-oriented attorney that was representing them and got this entire aspect of the law overturned. And we've been trying to see if we could get it fixed statutorily ever since. But again, frustrating. Ideally, the care coordinator is seeing a consumer at least 4 times a month, ACT team 6 times a month, weekly. Care coordinator and ACT team are putting information into a portal, and a monthly discussion has taken place live with the people that are involved. I will say that, just a small tangent here, the ACT teams, the care coordination teams, even the AOT office, post-pandemic and during the pandemic has been struggling with these outreach visits. I've heard breadcrumbs about this through the talk over the last couple of days. It's a real thing. It's a real issue. It's a real problem. We're probably at 60% staffing for these outreach services, which is incredibly difficult to do. And so if anyone wants to move to New York and be a care coordinator and not get paid a living wage, let me know. So the whole, as I mentioned earlier, the monitoring piece, once the court order is granted, is a really critical aspect of what AOT is about. Yes, the day in court is important, and we couldn't do what we do without that day in court, but it's the other stuff that is really what makes the system shift. We check for missed appointments and rescheduling. We monitor symptoms as they develop. We try and put out fires. We make small adjustments in how we're approaching situations. We assist with decision-making that the providers are stuck with. Hopefully the providers are telling us they're in trouble with something or something is not working. We have to keep sort of making the entire system talk to one another. And this is important to say because unfortunately I think the patients get a lot of the focus in AOT, right? Is the patient compliant or adhering with their order? The order is about the relationship between the patient and the system. So even though, yes, we can talk about the patient not being compliant with an order, the system has to comply with the order too. The system wasn't working for people like Andrew Goldstein and Kendra Webdale. So we have to make sure that the system is being responsive and doing their job for that client. That patients aren't falling through the cracks, that you know that this person's in trouble and you as a service have to do something about it. What are you gonna do? We're waiting. If you need help with the services that you're providing or if the person needs something else, let's talk about it, let's fix it, let's shift it, change it. But we really have to make sure that we're monitoring the relationship. We're not monitoring the patient, we're monitoring the relationship. The talk earlier this morning, Corey Miner-Smith talked about this, my man with the oxygen mask. As you think about getting involved, yes, you have to check in with yourself, but I would also encourage you to check in with your loved ones. Dear spouse, is this something that you think I can get involved with for I don't know how many years of my life? Is this something that the family can take on if I'm not 100% present sometimes because I'm dealing with this system, this individual? Check in with your finances. Is this something that you can take on? This is expensive. Check with your insurance provider, check with your employer. Do you have family and medical leave that you could use that you're not tapping into when you really have to not be at work because you're dealing with a crisis that lasts weeks, months, who knows? So really take your own pulse, put on your own gas mask, whatever you need to do, but take a minute, seriously, to figure it out. Crisis management, we all know this as loved ones and providers. Without AOT and someone's not taking their medications, we've got to figure out, okay, are they all right? They haven't taken their meds in a week. Do they need help? Are they in trouble? Or are they just kind of not taking their meds and everything seems okay? So as providers and as families, we wait, with bated breath about what's going to happen next, if it happens next. Eventually, we call 911 if it's needed, mobile crisis if we're lucky. And then that emergency evaluation happens. With AOT, ideally, we're bypassing the whole like wait for 911 kind of a moment to happen, and we can, when symptoms start to happen in the context of noncompliance and the presence of an order, we can bring someone in a lot sooner, not necessarily for an inpatient stay, maybe just to do like, hey, we haven't seen you in 2 weeks, you haven't been taking your meds in 1 week, what is happening? Yeah.
What about situations where the family member, the responsibility with the family, and you notice deterioration, there's a lot of conflict going on, they recognize the symptoms, so on, but the ACT team comes to the house to give them, provide them with whatever service, and they don't witness that. The respondent presents absolutely perfectly, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do, my mother gets upset when I'm a little agitated, but I'm fine, Who does, then, well, for us, it's incumbent upon the family then to do what we have in Louisiana order of protective custody to get them back into the hospital for evaluation. But the ACT team, the provider, how does it work in New York? So
Yeah.
Who is responsible for getting the individual back in for evaluation if they're deteriorating?
Right. So it's not unusual when you're working with siloed services to suddenly realize that the therapist isn't seeing what the residential supervisor isn't seeing and what the patient is describing. We're all getting different stories and it doesn't add up. So we do a big timeout. It's like, hey, let's all get on the same page. What is actually happening? We try and get everyone together. You're seeing this, you're saying that. What's the truth? And sometimes it's very revealing. Even if you end up just as confused on the other side of that meeting, at least we all know that there's a problem with communication, or there's a problem with identifying truth, or maybe things are changing rapidly, more rapidly than anyone realizes, and that's important to recognize. So again, there's no harm in that communication. If anything, in these situations, the more communication is better. And again, the monitoring. This is how we understand that there's different stories going on. There's rarely one truth in these scenarios, especially when there's a crisis. Yes.
I'm just wondering, in your team, do you have education for all of the members in your AOT team on the symptoms of these serious brain illnesses, i.e. schizophrenia and psychosis-related disorders? Do you, go over the symptoms? And we were just talking about how many of the potential clients that are having a psychotic episode, they can pull it together for like 10 minutes or whatever, and that could be when the investigator is coming over to talk with them. So I'm just wondering, do you talk about this and discuss it? Because I find within our journey that has prevented my loved one from getting the medical care that he needs promptly.
Yeah, absolutely. The care monitor, the social workers on our team are all social workers, so they have a certain level of obviously training and experience and supervisory time in the field and in different sort of jobs and positions. The people that are in the field, the ACT teams and the care coordinators, they're not as advanced in their years as a requirement of their employment, so their training can vary, their experience can vary. They do get a pretty big AOT sort of step up in training and how to document, how to report, what to see, what to not see, mental status exams. There's a variety of people's experience as they come into these fields. There are hundreds of employees doing this out in the field. So we try and get everybody ramped up, but you're obviously going to have a real pro on the ACT team, and you're going to have like somebody who's relatively a weaker care coordinator. There's someone who's great at this kind of a situation. There's another worker in the field that you just know might need a little bit of supervision when they get to this kind of situation. You sort of know that in just working with people, and hopefully, we can use that at the appropriate time. Patients can fluctuate in their symptoms. One of the biggest lessons that I ever had as a resident in training was I had this lovely conversation with somebody who had just been admitted, supposedly bipolar manic, talked to me about his history and his symptoms, and I couldn't figure out why he was on the unit. He'd just been admitted a few hours ago. I went back to start writing him up, and somebody said, hey, that person that you just spoke to, he's like totally naked and singing. So like, and it can happen. And so, you know, other eyes on a situation can be incredibly elucidating, incredibly helpful, not just for me as a provider, but for that client and making sure that he gets what he needs. So yes, we're all pressed for time. Cases are beyond belief as far as the census that an individual worker has to take care of. But we're there to try and help, and it's not always successful, and it's not always as good as it should be. But I'm going to move on. This is the renewal slide. You know, court orders last different amounts of time in the community, and we have an important kind of review that occurs on the AOT team, whether we renew an individual or not. And we review how things have been going, how the reports have been, significant events that have occurred. We get information from providers. Hopefully that information from family, if families involved, is also coming to us. You know, families write to us, families communicate with us about how they feel and what they think should happen. Some families testify in court. I won't say whether that always happens with the particular judge that I have to deal with in Queens. That's a whole other storytelling hour. You know, we take a lot of factors into consideration. In the statute, we have to meet criteria all over again to renew the order, with the exception of that hospitalization in the last 3 years. But everything else still we have to testify to in court, still needed. Still wouldn't do treatment without an order, wouldn't voluntarily participate, would benefit from AOT. We have to feel that they still need the order. The judges tend to want to hear that this service is working and therefore it should continue, or the person is still kind of rough around the edges and still needs more support and more time with this. That's basically our arguments at the renewal stage. So whatever supports we give by testimony or by evidence, records, things like that, the better. People who are more likely to benefit, bottom line is people who respond to treatment. Big surprise. If you get the treatment and you do better, you tend to do better on AOT. Antisocial, very bad substance abuse, where that's the primary problem. They don't do well with AOT. It's very hard to mandate substance abuse services for someone who doesn't admit that substances are a problem in their lives. That's not to say that they don't end up benefiting, but I don't know why. I literally don't know why. I'll have a slide about that. So I won't get into this because it's in a lot of the literature about AOT, but the Duke study found that hospitalization rates go down, the number of hospitalization days go down with AOT, number of arrests go down with AOT. It's been published in the literature. It's now almost 12 years old. We're not talking enough about bias at this conference. There's a significant issue with bias. I have always struggled with the issue of AOT good, AOT bad. If I ask families, they would say AOT is great. It helps their family member. They don't fall through the cracks anymore. AOT is like, where do I sign up? If you ask the patients, you might get a very different story. AOT bad. I don't want to be in front of a judge. I don't want to have somebody read my records. I don't want to be court mandated to anything. Of course. So nevertheless, and as the Duke study pointed out, the individuals who end up in the public mental health system tend to be individuals of color at higher rates than the population. Ergo, the people that get referred to AOT show proportionally the same higher numbers. We've been working hard on AOT to really look at bias, look at the factors that we use to make a determination, look at the language that's being sent to us about how a person is doing, how agitated they are, how scary they are in the community, and really sort of looking at all those reports and all that language with a very jaundiced eye, because we don't want to be part of the problem. In a 5-county sample, this was brought up earlier, I think yesterday, AOT costs do dramatically go down. Even when you're paying for AOT programs to be developed in a region, and that costs money, the ultimate savings is still dramatically lower with people on AOT. They're just using the system less. So you're spending less money on the system, even though you're investing in making the system better. This is a study that we did in our own backyard. AOT individuals who graduated with a happy ending. So they did well, they were offered a voluntary, they graduated all together, as opposed to the people who moved away, died, went missing, went into long-term imprisonment. So these are just happy endings. We were looking at, what went into the happy endings, what are they like, using Medicaid data for the state of New York. So we could look at not just how they were in the records that we had, but the 12 months before AOT, the last 12 months they were on AOT, and 12 months after AOT was over. So we're not monitoring them. They're still out there in the community, but we have no idea what's going on in their lives. All we're just doing is checking what happened and billing Medicaid with them after we were out of the picture. So, pretty dramatic. The first column is their life before AOT and a number of inpatient days per month of the year, going across the bottom. The last 12 months they were on AOT, dramatically lower inpatient days, which you would expect, a very dramatic pre-AOT high, during AOT low. But this was fascinating. Even a year after we're out of the picture, it's still low. So there is something about AOT, and we've tried to parse out statistically what it could be, and we struggle a lot with that because we haven't been able to find something obvious. There's something about the secret sauce of what a treatment plan or the monitoring or the judge or all of it, I don't know, does to maybe, at least for that first year after the order is gone, to sort of preserve somebody relatively healthier as far as hospitalizations are concerned. Each line going from left to right is an individual's life based on inpatient days. So you can see the same columns before AOT, last year on AOT, and that same column going into their year after AOT is out of the picture. Just sort of person. Just one page of a very long bars. Substance abuse, I mentioned that earlier, people do better. Even when there's substance abuse and mental health issues in the issue, post-AOT, they're still doing better. I don't know why. Because, and I'm incredulous because during AOT, we're still struggling with their substance abuse issues, but I think part of what we deal with, again, isn't hospitalized or no, it's other stuff. It's, maybe a petty arrest, or maybe getting kicked out of the residence, or maybe it's, the family complaining that they're using drugs all day. So it's not a hospitalization level, like, oh, what do we do? But it's like not a sense of well-being, that can be measured with other things other than hospitalization. So the day-to-day sort of struggles of their lives continue because of the substance abuse. It might not reach to the level of needing a hospitalization, but as we monitor, that's still kind of the texture of what the monitoring is about, is their ongoing substance abuse issues. What we found was what I just said. So I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, which is quickly going out. So summarizing for the talk today, AOT underscores the severity of their illness and the importance of treatment. If nothing else, the people that don't want to be in court but have to be in court are going to start to consider things that they would do in order to prevent being in court. If somebody doesn't mind being in front of a judge or in front of 12 cops, AOT is not going to do a lot for that person, right? So somebody who's used to being ground up in that system and doesn't mind it, or somebody who, wants 12 different providers to call all the time, that person is not going to care if they're now court mandated to communicate with providers. So individuals with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, often they don't do as well with AOT because they're already so chaotic and disorganized that they just chew up everything that AOT throws at them. But individuals who don't want to be in court, who don't want to be hospitalized, those are individuals who do better. kind of logical. Providers, it identifies specific patients whose compliance patterns must trigger immediate attention and helps identify and retain them in appropriate care. If you're a provider and you've only got 12 minutes to see this patient and write your note, and you don't know what happens when you're going to see them 3 months down the road, it's great to have AOT in the background. It's great to have a care coordinator because it helps your sense of responsibility for this individual and the treatment that you're providing them. It's very hard when the system is the way it is in a Medicaid and a public healthcare setting, where you're not really allowed to give time to the patient that you'd like to give. It's not fair. For caretakers such as yourselves, shift some of the burden of monitoring and crisis management to an outside AOT process, we hope. Healthcare systems, it monitors individuals traveling through different elements of the system and maximizes the continuity of that care despite that traveling. And for communities, obviously, people in need of care and monitoring are kept safe. You gotta ask yourself to what degree you're gonna check off this list, right? There's no wrong answer. It's just the answer that matters to you. There are various aspects of the system, from the government side, from the patient care side to the advocacy side, with communicating with providers, communicating with your legislatures, finding out who's on healthcare committees in Congress, who's writing the bills, who's co-signing the bills. All this stuff is public information. Where is the money going? Oh my God, where is the money going? Who's getting the money? Just follow that. And follow those email addresses and those websites. That's a world of knowledge right there. So, there's a difference between getting totally uninvolved and being 100% involved. It's not, neither one is usually correct. There's a huge gray area, and the gray area for you is the gray area that matters and is important. So if you want to be the person to call in an emergency, fine. If you want to be the person to let us know when something is happening in the community that shouldn't be happening, fine. If you want to be the first call whenever anything goes wrong, fine. You tell us how to interact with you. Tell the ACT team how to interact with you, the care coordinator team how to interact with you. What are you comfortable with? That'll help, period. That helps. Even if you tell us what your boundaries are, hopefully you've got providers that work within your boundaries, and hopefully we'll handle the rest. Thank you for your attention. How many of you are actually families of loved ones? This is amazing, and I think this is probably the largest group that has ever met as a family, as a group learning about AOT. So tell your friends. Questions?
While I am a family member, I'm also a provider. So I have a question. Dr. Garza, you mentioned Medicaid reimbursement a couple times. And while I know Medicaid reimburses some of the services that AOT may order, is Medicaid or any other MCO reimbursing any aspect of the AOT process at this time? Because that is one of my goals.
It is not. All of our funding comes from state funds. And interesting story, I had a judge on the bench actually accuse me of getting paid more if I had more people on my service, on the AOT service, from the bench during testimony. So, the judge isn't always giving the black robe effect that you'd like. But no, whether we have 5 people that we're monitoring, I can't even imagine such a possibility, or 500, it's still the same pot of money.
Are we working on that? Is Treatment Advocacy Center working on that? Because I would like to offer myself as a family member or provider and someone who's worked in managed care for 7 years. I will advocate for that.
Thank you. I don't work for TAC, but I will say that Medicaid, we see these cost savings with the Medicaid that I showed earlier. Early on, private insurance companies were sort of very curious about what we were doing, because especially...
I'm on leave without pay to be here. That's how much they don't get it.
Right. 100%. Private insurance companies start to recognize that we're actually saving money if we put somebody on a care coordinator. Yeah, I mean, money talks. Know your money argument, depending on who you speak to, who you try and advocate. Make that part of the language that you use, because it talks. I think the cost savings. The next fight is making sure that those cost savings go right back into the system in parts that are lacking. That it doesn't go to golf courses or something, right? So great that we're saving money. Where's that saved money going to go? Like, because the system is still hurting. Again, I joked about, maybe inappropriately, that care coordinators don't make a living wage for New York City. New York City is a very expensive place to live, but you want good people doing that job, you know? You want trained people, experienced people doing those very difficult jobs in the field, like walking up those stairs in the projects after dark to give somebody an injection. Like, that's a scary, scary job. And so, yeah, they should be paid accordingly. But anyway, next question.
I appreciate how difficult the job must be, like, especially certain times, certain situations, just as you were saying. I can only imagine. But when it comes to the family members, like, does, I guess you could just speak in general about your plan. I don't want to single out whatever, but does the plan like actively seek to incorporate like family members or caregivers? That's what I found was lacking in my situation. So,
Yeah.
and we haven't really talked about that. I experienced through this conference where the family members aren't always a big part of the AOT. Would you agree? Or
The support for AOT obviously had tremendous support from family members. The law wouldn't have been the law without family being involved. I can tell you that the training that I have, very little was spent teaching me about how to work with families, how to talk to families, how to get providers of housing, of room and board and things like that in the conversation. And I can promise you that other individuals in other disciplines also don't have a lot of training in that. So yeah, this is an area of how AOT functions that could be tremendously helpful, more helpful than it is, tremendously useful, more useful than it's been so far. And again, I want to focus on getting you guys to look around, because this is a tremendous political force and power that you all share. And I think within that power, you can help change and shift the needle dramatically. I know I pay attention when a family member is coming up to me with a situation, or when I can tell you the judges pay attention to when families are testifying in court. I can tell you that attorneys rely on family testimony when it comes to the day in court. That's so important. So again, if you're comfortable, push that agenda for yourself. Make the calls, get the phone numbers, get the email addresses. Be a part of it. It's a lot, and it's going to take a lot. It's going to be taxing. But if you can take it on, take it on. But yes, it is a shortfall, I think, for the system as it's designed. But that doesn't mean the system is, set in stone. Far from it. I mean, AOT wasn't around 20 years ago. But let's change the system, because it's not perfect.
I really realistically think that it's probably a good situation if there is a family to go back to just have that like incorporate from the beginning as the goal, the pre and post goal. And I just wondered, with the renewal process, it seems to be a lot of renewals happening. Do you have to identify like what you'll do to prevent another renewal? Like, is there some kind of measurement or graphs you use to figure out how you can keep from renewing, because you would rather graduate quicker, I would assume.
Yeah, thank you for that question in particular, because keep in mind that AOT is not it's not the end goal, right? That day in court is not mission accomplished. That's day one, right? That's day one. That's getting the patient to recognize, okay, we're now court mandating this aspect of your recovery, okay? Because doing the recovery on your own has not worked. So now you're going to have all these supports to sort of formalize that recovery path. And some people are renewed for years on end. Some people are never renewed. They get it on the first order. They may not ever not have anosognosia, but they know that they don't want to be in the hospital. They don't want to be kicked out of their home. They don't want to see dad cry. They don't want to end up in jail. So they're going to take that injection, which kind of doesn't feel like anything after it's in. And they're going to do blank because they don't want that other stuff to happen. That's enough. That's all the judges need to hear. It's not ideal for that patient, and I wish they understood their illness. I wish they understood their symptoms. I wish they, had agency over symptom management 100%, but many don't, and many will never. But they can learn how to problem solve enough to stay out of those negative consequences that they've had all their lives. So it's a way to enforce recovery at the start with the hope that they will eventually be able to take that on. We do that with the voluntary agreement sometimes as a sort of mini step towards that. I won't get into that, but that's kind of how we use it. Who's got the mic? Yeah, thank you.
My question is multiple parts, and I apologize for that. As an AOT team, how did your team members, your care coordinators navigate the issue of, say, a family or a friend or a loved one that may be acting in bad faith or jumping too quickly on the gun, so to speak, with a loved one that, as far as the petition goes, or an individual we're wanting to address for supportive housing when there isn't housing available,
Right.
or frankly, just when the money isn't there to reimburse for these services, to pay for these services, because all you have is the grant money and then what Medicaid allows.
Right. We have providers in the field who do take money, who do have a certain allowance for people without any coverage. A lot of our population can't or won't access Medicaid. And so most of our providers have some capacity to do that. A lot of private insurance companies won't pay for ACT, won't pay for care coordination. So a lot of those programs have to take it on the chin. For the active, shall we say, family member that maybe has some misguided ideas about how medication or this or that program or service should operate, we have to get involved. They're a part of that person's family and they're a factor in their well-being, for better or worse. So we have to get that person involved. We have to do some education. I've had family members kind of open up capsules and like reproportion meds. I've had judges line item medications, line edit out medications from treatment plans. So it's not just family members, it's providers who get on the phone. It's like, hey, this person didn't show up. I think you need to go pick them up. It's Monday, 10 a.m. and they're still not here. Like that's not how we remove. This is not a punishment. This is not like do this or else kind of program. And that takes a lot of education and that takes a lot of reorienting how people understand AOT and what it does. But yeah, for that individual who just sometimes doesn't get it, we got to do some education. That's a lot of what we do, educating, reorienting, informing, communicating.
And the housing?
Housing, yeah. I mean, we are not sitting on 50,000 units of available housing, just to be clear. There's, again, one of the positive things about AOT is whether we're talking about housing slots, care coordination slots, ACT slots, an AOT designated patient goes to the top of the wait list. So that's huge, huge, huge. Right now, there's probably just in my county alone, I think 60 people waiting for ACT. Inpatient, outpatient, they're just waiting for an ACT slot. I get two slots per week. That's it. And more get referred every week. We're waiting for ACT, waiting for ACT, waiting for ACT. The system is just beyond stretch. And I have an ACT team with 2 members on it. Like, how do you do anything with an ACT team with 2 members on it? Mike? Oh, sorry.
So I know that you briefly touched on the bias part of things, and I guess maybe not so much a question, possibly. Do you think that a large part of the reason why you don't see maybe that socioeconomic class, middle higher level, be brought into AOT because they can facilitate other means? I mean, because for us, it's like largely a part of our community mental health center that we bring these folks in that are part of our, you know, in our system and so forth, so forth like that. And yes, we're dealing more with like a homeless population, you know, things like that. So do you think that some of the people that have maybe private insurance, things like that are utilizing a different service versus being put into EOT, even though they may have all of the same criteria, going to the hospital, you know, could potentially, you know, be a danger to themselves, others, you know, have criminal charges, but because of their means have been able to kind of, you know, get out of those, things like that. How do you see that?
Yeah, the criteria for AOT is pretty broad, as I wrote it earlier, right? As I listed it earlier. So there are a lot of clients that fall into that. So whether someone chooses to refer this person with means or this person without means to us, I can't necessarily control that. All we can do is educate. Once they're within the AOT rubric, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're managing all patients, you know, with equanimity, whether they do well, whether they're brought before the judge or not, whether we graduate them or not, that all has to be based on facts and evidence. And for better or for worse, these judges and the very active mental hygiene legal service that represents clients has kept us on our toes as far as determining, okay, which evidence do I present for which case based on my desire for renewing this client, right? Because if it's not based on evidence, on facts, then I have no business continuing that AOT order. And we all have to do that internal check-in with ourselves because, well, there's internal bias and we have to address that and acknowledge that and then push past that in order to make good decisions as far as the program goes.
Yeah, just wanted to maybe offer a couple of things. So obviously AOT, I think, is the missing piece in terms of getting people stabilized so we can connect them to a continuum of care. A lot of people ended up dropping out of mental health care, seeking care for themselves because they couldn't get that continuum that they were looking for. We have clients that said, geez, if I'd known about ACT teams, but when this first happened to me, I wouldn't have ended up having to go to the hospital so many times. But of course, they became systems resistant, deteriorated, you know, substance use disorder, all that goes along with it, and then had to wrestle them into AOT and convince them to trust the system again. And it's very difficult to do, but that helps. As far as the MCOs and Medicaid funding, maybe additional services, reimbursable services for public health AOT, there is a CMS IMD waiver, it's an 1115 demonstration waiver for social determinants of health, which I think is something that would not only benefit the whole population, but again, adds more resources. And then of course, you know, we definitely, I see Congress has allocated more money this year to AOT than to ACT, which makes absolutely no sense at all because AOT can't operate with ACT. So that is just, again, you know, I think where all of these folks can plug in and the treatment advocacy center to, you know, increase funding and remove those policy barriers.
Yeah, and just to get granular about how that funding is thought about, I would rather have better paid, fully staffed ACT team members than have 4 more ACT teams that are at, you know, at half staffing. You know what I mean? I would rather have people be paid more and end up with jobs that are desired because they pay well and are well protected and paid for, than having like 3 more teams that don't operate well because they can't get staffed with their low salaries. Mike.
Yes, as a family member, I really thank you for the time you took to put this great presentation together for us. In California, in my county, Contra Costa, we used you as a North Star, as the information that was needed to bring AOT back into our county. Now, a question I have is, I look at AOT as being on the continuum of care. There are times when people may step down, and there may be times when people need to step up. And because they may need a locked situation so that they can benefit from AOT. Do you have any mechanism where there is the continuum of care model where you can step people up and you can step people down?
What we do is, I alluded to it earlier, the voluntary agreement, where we lose the ability to remove somebody if they don't do well, but we still get them to agree to monitor how they do. So in other words, they have a court order for 1, 2, 3 years. They've done well. They have good relationships with their providers. Providers are still kind of wondering, maybe they miss appointments sometimes, but we don't have much of an argument for a renewal anymore. So we won't go back to court, congratulations, but we would like to offer you a voluntary because your providers are still unsure. We'd like to do a 6-month order just to make sure that things are okay, that you're not just telling me you're going to continue your treatment once the court order is over. Would you allow us to monitor you? And then it becomes just a very big HIPAA release form because we can't monitor without permission outside of a court order, right? So they'll sign that, we'll monitor them for 6 months. 9 times out of 10, it's thumbs up and we graduate them. Stepping up, after we graduate someone, they will sometimes come back to us once, twice, 3 times. They'll say, you know what, you did really well on AOT, in the aughts. And I see you're having a lot of trouble now. Your mom died last year. You're now in supervised residential housing. Things are tougher. You've had some troubles. You know how AOT works. We're going to go to the judge and have him or her talk about getting you back on AOT for a period. Let's tighten things up, get things back to the way they were as far as your stability in the community. So we'll have re-referrals to AOT. Many people we know from years past, they come back to us. AOT is a tool, right? You don't always use the tool that you have in the toolbox for everything. Sometimes you get to put the tool away, but sometimes you need that tool.
Dr. Garza, what is the time frame for the initial commitment order and the time frame for the renewal orders? Thank you.
Nothing beyond a year for the initial or the renewal. At the very beginning of the law, it was a 6-month initial with a 1-year renewal. But right now it's anything between now and a year. Our judge, well, I shouldn't say our current judge, but we had a judge for 4 or 5 years who loathed hearing our cases, to put it mildly. He wanted all arrangements to be done like before he signed off on a case. By agreement, the patient agrees to a 6-month renewal or an 8-month renewal or an 11-month renewal. And so the judge just wanted it worked out. He didn't want to hear cases. And if he had to hear a case, he would often rule in favor of the person who was willing to accept an agreement and against the person who didn't accept the last offer. So we would lose cases sometimes because he heard that we didn't want to give somebody a 2-month order. So, but typically right now we have a more reasonable judge, new judge to AOT, so her learning curve is curving. She allows for some hearings. But it's a big docket. It's a lot of patients. It's like 17, 25 cases, just AOT, once a week. So it's a lot of cases. But a year typically, and plus the negotiation that inevitably happens. That's just in our county. The mic is traveling.
Thank you. I was just wondering, I was at Tips for Improving Your Program yesterday in Ballroom A, and they talked a lot about measuring effectiveness of your AOT or just an AOT in general. Did you find that you're using any tools that were very effective to monitor how well you're doing? How many people, do the clients set goals from the get-go, and then if they attain those goals, is that like an indicator of success? Do you have tools that you monitor that?
We don't have specific clinical tools that we use. However, I will say on the issue of software and data collection, if you have the potential to spend a little bit more money on a little bit better system, if you can add some capacity to your systems to have gosh, I can't even explain it. Legal people and clinical people on your team and the administrative people on your team access the same database. It saves so much time. Right now, we're in a system with a lot of, electronically held information, but it's like different systems that don't necessarily talk to one another, and it makes certain jobs very cumbersome and annoying and slow. It gets done, but I know, I'm not a computer guy, but I know there must be systems that can speak to all parties and can utilize the same data and just manipulate it in different ways for the work that gets done day to day. So if you're in a program or you work or communicate with a program, project management software, things that are above my pay grade, but I think there's software and programs out there that really help collect all kinds of data. That's all I'll say about it. But data. Like if you can collect it, I promise you will use it. If not now, eventually.
I apologize, but we're gonna have to clear the room right at 11:45 because we're serving lunch in here and they're gonna need to close out that wall, so maybe just get a
Last question.
I'm from Washington State, and we don't have an office of mental health. And so I was noticing on your early slides that you showed your Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and I'm curious how critical that state organization and structure was to the development of AOT.
The Office of Mental Health is what distributes the funds to the individual counties. As I said, the legislature was the statute was a little unusual in that it tied the actual counties to the money, and the monies to the county. So as such, a lot of the legal processes are also county-based. So when we have individuals that bounce around to different counties, it makes it very frustrating because the law has to be exercised on a county-by-county basis. New York City is a little unusual because in most places you have cities within a county. In New York City, it's the opposite. You've got counties within a city. So that's why we have the county DCS, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene for New York City, is sort of the county officer, if you will. It's like a multi-county clearinghouse where all these services speak to. The Office of Mental Health licenses, but they're actually managed by the Director of Community Services for a county. So, and again, with New York City, it's unusual because it's a multi-county DCS. But they, for now, are overseeing that we're following what the statute is telling us what we're supposed to be doing. So there's a certain legal statutory requirement that creates the structure and the money. But then it's, like I said, the lower half of that graph is where the proof in the pudding, like that communication, those relationships, that's yours and mine for the creating. Thank you all.